Today, we open a door most people pretend not to see. The scandals you scroll past, celebrity trials, leaked DMs, secret payoffs, aren't new. In Renaissance Italy, power danced with desire in palaces, studios, convents, and courts. Artists bargained with bodies, nobles hid contracts of love, priests whispered in locked rooms, courtesans ruled like queens. Behind silk curtains, reputations rose, fortunes fell, and a single rumor could burn a family name. These aren't gentle tales. They're bold, dangerous, and shockingly familiar. If modern headlines make you gasp, wait until you hear how Florence, Venice, and Rome turned passion into power, and power into control. Tell us where you're watching from, then stay close. The strangest secrets are about to breathe again. Stay ready. Jeffrey Epstein's scandal shocked the modern world. Hidden power, secret rooms, forbidden exchanges. But Renaissance Italy had its own Epsteins, moving behind silk and marble. In Florence, wealth and lust shaped lives in ways darker than court files admit. Tonight, one courtesan's secret rewrote the fate of noble bloodlines. In Florence's gilded halls, wealth was not the only currency. Desire was just as powerful. Among the many shadows of Renaissance society stood Isabella di Rossi, a courtesan whose name slipped through diaries, whispered in markets, and lingered in the letters of noblemen. Unlike noble wives bound by duty, Isabella owned her power. Her chambers were decorated with velvet curtains, mirrors framed in gold, and perfumes imported from the East. Men who entered believed they were in control, yet they always left subdued, conquered by her whispered promises. Her story mirrors the secretive power of Jeffrey Epstein. Just as his rooms concealed forbidden bargains, Isabella's silken palace became a stage for hidden exchanges, land rights, political favors, alliances sealed not in boardrooms, but in beds. Chroniclers like Benedetto Varchi noted how Florence's leaders feared courtesans more than rival states, for one careless night could reshape a dynasty. Isabella understood this perfectly. She turned every gaze, every embrace into leverage. For her, passion was not weakness, it was strategy, a weapon sharper than any dagger carried by men who sought to own her. Behind the gilded gates of Florence's palaces, the Medici family orchestrated not only politics, but also spectacles of indulgence that blurred the line between feasting and forbidden ritual. This echoes the hidden networking of Harvey Weinstein. Just as Weinstein used Hollywood dinners to bind actors and producers to his will, the Medici crafted feasts where favors were bought not with gold, but with surrender. A nobleman who hesitated could lose influence overnight, while one who yielded might rise unexpectedly in Florence's court. At one infamous gathering, recorded in fragments by Giovanni Cavalcanti, the Medici seated rivals beside courtesans, each chosen carefully for her ability to ensnare and expose. Laughter covered the tension, but beneath the music and roasted meats lay humiliation, calculated seduction, and the silent trading of reputations. In this arena, pleasure became politics, and the Medici proved that desire was the ultimate leash. For those who dined in these halls, the cost of a single night could echo across generations. In Renaissance Italy, secret brotherhoods thrived in shadows, cloaked as philosophical circles or artistic guilds, but pulsing with hidden practices that terrified church authorities. These gatherings, described in fragments of ecclesiastical trial records, blended intellectual debate with coded exchanges of passion. Here, sexuality became both rebellion and a whispered form of loyalty. This mirrors Bill Clinton's scandal with Monica Lewinsky, where coded language and secrecy defined relationships of power. Just as the Oval Office became the stage for private desire disguised as political formality, So too did Florentine brotherhoods turn scholarly halls into theaters of forbidden intimacy. Words became veils, and silence was as revealing as touch. Chroniclers such as Benedetto Varchi hinted that members of these groups used allegories of Plato and Ovid to mask their confessions of love and lust. To outsiders, these were harmless debates on poetry and philosophy. To initiates, every verse carried a double meaning, an invitation, a promise, or a declaration of surrender. In this delicate balancing act, the church's power clashed with human desire, and men of influence risked not only their reputations but also their lives. For them, passion was coded rebellion, written in metaphors no priest could erase. The Medici courts of Florence were glittering stages where power and pleasure intertwined. Behind marble walls and golden tapestries, court life was less about governance and more about performance. Every gesture, glance, and whispered exchange became part of a game of seduction. Courtiers often found themselves compelled to satisfy both political and intimate appetites of their patrons, where refusal meant exile or worse. This parallels Tiger Woods' infidelity scandal, where fame and status amplified temptation and desire became a spectacle under public gaze. Just as Tiger's affairs blurred private life with public reputation, so too did Florentine courtiers risk exposure when hidden indulgences clashed with the Medici family's iron grip on appearances. Letters preserved from Cosimo I's court hint at liaisons between nobles and entertainers masked as theatrical rehearsals. A play's performance could conceal a tryst. A masquerade ball provided anonymity for passions forbidden in daylight. In such spaces, lust and politics became inseparable, and the performance never ended. Every affair was a wager, every betrayal a potential downfall, and every embrace an act that could shift alliances. Here, the court was both a palace of glory and a prison of desire. But the Medici's theater of desire was only one act in a longer play. Beyond Florence's glittering courts, darker stories stirred in convent walls, where vows of chastity collided with secret cravings. What happened when holy devotion masked forbidden lust? The next scandal shatters faith, power, and flesh alike. The Harvey Weinstein scandal exposed how powerful men exploited silence in modern Hollywood. Yet in Renaissance Italy, centuries earlier, cloistered convents hid scandals just as shocking. Behind stone walls, nuns sworn to chastity defied vows, weaving secret webs of lust and power. Their hidden desires shook faith itself. In the grandeur of Renaissance Italy, convents were seen as sanctuaries of virtue, places where noble daughters and widows were cloistered to live in quiet devotion. Yet history whispers of another truth. Court records from Florence and Venice reveal how convent walls became the stage for hidden dramas. Families often forced young women into nunneries, not for faith, but to avoid costly dowries. Trapped, many resisted their confinement with acts of rebellion, some subtle, some scandalous. Letters smuggled from San Zaccaria in Venice tell of noble nuns who arranged secret meetings with powerful patrons. Behind heavy wooden doors, chambers turned into arenas of forbidden touch and whispered vows. Desire clashed with sacred duty, creating a storm of ecstasy and guilt. Just like Weinstein's Hollywood, where women faced exploitation behind closed studio doors, Renaissance convents bore tales of power and coercion dressed in sanctity. These stories unsettle us because they reveal that lust and control do not belong only to Hollywood producers or corrupt men in suits. They thrived even under the guise of God's authority. While convents held shadows of rebellion, the streets of Florence and Rome carried their own coded whispers. Lovers, unable to meet in public, turned to the written word. But these weren't ordinary letters. They were disguised as prayer scrolls or hidden inside hymnals. Archivio di Stato in Florence preserves fragments where lines of sacred scripture conceal sentences of passion. One famous case involved Isabella de' Medici, whose letters revealed bold liaisons behind her family's political facade.
She used poems to mask declarations of desire, words that could be read innocently by a priest, yet held fire when deciphered by her chosen partner. The language was bold, unapologetic, crafted to inflame and to bind. Here, power and lust became intertwined with literacy itself. To write was to control, to seduce, to resist confinement. This echoes Bill Clinton's scandal centuries later, where letters, confessions, and testimonies revealed truths that power tried to bury. Then as now, paper became the battlefield where private desire clashed with public shame. In both eras, words were never just ink. They were weapons, confessions, and chains of forbidden longing. If letters held secrets in ink, the carnival mask was the shield of flesh itself. During Venice's famed Carnival, citizens cloaked themselves in anonymity. Behind silk masks, boundaries dissolved. Priests mingled with courtesans, nobles with peasants, men with men, women with women. The mask was not just costume, but permission, erasing rank, gender, and duty.
One diary from 16th century Venice records nobles slipping into brothels disguised as paupers. Behind the mask, they surrendered not only to desire, but to the thrill of power reversed. A servant might command a lord in intimate games. A lady might toy with the very men who governed her life by day. Power shifted, bodies collided, and forbidden ecstasies thrived in silence. This recalls Tiger Woods' scandals centuries later, his carefully built image shattered by hidden indulgences. Like Renaissance masks, his polished public persona concealed countless private liaisons. When truth emerged, it wasn't only about sex. It was about the collapse of secrecy, the stripping away of disguise. Both Carnival and Scandal remind us, when masks fall, the world is forced to see what power wants to hide. No tale of Renaissance Italy can ignore the courtesans, those women who moved between scandal and reverence with equal grace. They were not mere companions, they were educators of pleasure, trusted advisors, even political pawns. Venetian courtesan Veronica Franco, for example, left behind poetry and letters that revealed both her brilliance and the dangerous intimacy she offered to the city's elite. Courtesans embodied paradox, exalted by nobles for their wit and beauty, condemned by priests for their sins. Yet behind their jeweled doors, power flowed both ways. A duke might enter seeking dominance, but leave as a man conquered by whispers, debts, and shame. Desire was not free, it had a price, and often that price was influence. Here lies the echo of Tiger Woods' scandal too, where passion, secrecy, and downfall intertwined. His world of control and status cracked under the weight of affairs, just as patrons in Venice risked ruin when letters or poems revealed their forbidden liaisons. Both remind us, the higher the pedestal, the greater the fall when desire pulls it down. The courtesans ruled their world with wit and whispers, but their power was fragile, always one scandal away from collapse. What happened when betrayal cut deeper than passion? In Florence, a tale unfolded where loyalty, lust, and ambition collided, leaving ruins greater than any battlefield. Harvey Weinstein's scandal exposed how power could silence voices and trap women in webs of fear and favors. But centuries earlier, Renaissance Italy had its own Weinstein, hidden in courts and theaters, where noble patrons demanded submission in exchange for fame, fortune, or mere survival. The stage masked their sins. In Renaissance Italy, theaters and courts were not just spaces for art, they were marketplaces of desire, where women and men alike were weighed against the appetites of their patrons. Much like Harvey Weinstein controlled actresses' futures in Hollywood, wealthy patrons of the 1500s determined who rose to fame, who faded into obscurity, and who was coerced into silence.
Letters preserved in Venetian nobles describe secretive auditions where talent was measured not only in voice or grace, but in how willingly one surrendered to the powerful. Court diaries note how aspiring performers, desperate to survive, found themselves bound by promises, stripped of choice. It was an unspoken contract. Access to wealth and prestige required submission to the lust of patrons. In Florence, the Medici records reveal complaints from families whose daughters had been lured into private performances. Behind gilded curtains, beauty was currency, and silence was survival. Unlike today, where victims eventually gained a stage to speak out, these Renaissance voices were buried under layers of honor, shame, and fear. The scandal of Weinstein may have rocked the modern stage, but Renaissance Italy already knew what it meant when power wrote the script and desire directed the play. If the stage was where the public saw beauty, the hidden chambers of Renaissance palaces were where that beauty was exploited. Just as Weinstein invited actresses into hotel suites under the guise of business meetings, powerful patrons of Renaissance Italy often summoned singers, dancers, and courtesans into private chambers where the terms of success were rewritten behind locked doors. Reports from Venetian archives describe noblemen hosting intimate gatherings after grand performances, where young women were pressured to remain long after the music stopped. Diaries from courtiers mentioned whispered warnings. Behind the velvet, reputations are made or destroyed. These meetings were rarely optional. Refusal meant exile from the patron's network, a career that ended before it began. In Florence, the Medici family's lavish estates contained concealed rooms, painted with mythological scenes that blurred the line between art and seduction. Historians suggest these spaces were deliberately crafted to stage private liaisons under the cloak of cultural refinement. In these rooms, art was not simply admired, it was consumed, embodied, and exploited. The echoes between Weinstein's Hollywood and the Medici's Florence are chilling. Both eras revealed how power could disguise itself as opportunity, and how dreams were bound to nightmares by contracts no one dared speak of. In Renaissance Italy, silence was often the most expensive currency. Just as Weinstein's victims described signing non-disclosure agreements and fearing blacklisting in Hollywood, young women in Florence, Venice, and Rome faced their own contracts of silence. Though unwritten, they were no less binding. Letters preserved in Florentine archives revealed desperate pleas from women to their patrons, requests for dowries, housing, or protection in exchange for keeping unseen arrangements hidden. Some of these letters carried the tone of bargaining. Others sounded like cries from cages built of velvet. In Venice, courtesans who resisted their patrons' demands often found themselves slandered in the gossip networks of the city, their reputations destroyed by whispers more lethal than swords.
The price of silence was not always measured in gold. Sometimes it was measured in survival. Families of entertainers depended on noble benefactors, and refusing advances could mean starvation for entire households. Diaries of minor nobles note how easily reputations could be ruined with a single phrase, "She is ungrateful." That one word could erase a woman's future. The silence that bound victims in both Renaissance palaces and modern Hollywood reveals the oldest weapon of power, control not only of bodies, but of voices. What was spoken could vanish, but what was kept quiet could kill. When we look at Weinstein's empire and the way his name controlled every room he entered, it becomes impossible not to see a reflection in Renaissance Italy's most powerful houses. The Medici, the Sforza, and the Venetian elite ruled not only with politics and armies, but with hidden chambers of desire. Their influence spread like fire, consuming anyone who resisted. Court records from Florence detail secret trials against women accused of slander, yet the true crime was daring to speak of what powerful men demanded behind locked doors. The women were punished not for lies, but for truth. The Medici archives even preserve notes of payments made to silence rumors. small sums compared to the vast fortunes they held, but priceless to those forced into silence. Just as Weinstein hand-picked victims from aspiring actresses desperate for a chance, Renaissance lords preyed upon courtesans, servants, and even the daughters of rival families. It was never just lust, it was domination dressed as opportunity. To be chosen was both an honor and a sentence. The echoes of power never fade. From palace halls to Hollywood suites, the same shadow remains. When men hold unchecked authority, their desires write history in whispers of pain. The halls of Florence hid secrets as dark as Weinstein's suites, and the whispers of women lost to silence still echo centuries later. Yet if Florence trembled under hidden lust, Venice turned its sins into open spectacle. Masks concealed more than faces. Desires flourished where no law dared interfere. When the world gasped at Bill Clinton's entanglement with Monica Lewinsky, they saw how power and intimacy can entrap even the most untouchable leaders. Renaissance Venice mirrored this drama centuries earlier, behind masks, inside palaces, and through whispers of courtesans who swayed politics with secrets that could topple a republic. One courtesan, Veronica Franco, became both muse and menace. Her writings, preserved in letters and poems, reveal how passion blurred with politics. She was adored in salons, yet her intimacy with powerful senators made her both respected and suspect. Like Monica Lewinsky centuries later, her personal life became ammunition in public battles, her private letters weaponized by enemies. But Venice's scandal had a crueler edge. Unlike Lewinsky, courtesans could be accused of witchcraft if they overstepped male authority. Court records showed that Franco herself was tried. Her sensual power turned against her. She survived, but not without scars, proving that in Renaissance Italy, female allure could bring both influence and ruin. Could you imagine living in a world where your beauty was both your weapon and your curse? Comment if this duality feels even harsher than scandals today. Florence, the heart of Renaissance brilliance, also pulsed with shadows of scandal. Behind the walls of grand Medici palaces, whispers of forbidden union spread faster than the ink on Machiavelli's pen. Power was currency, and so too was passion. Yet when the two collided, the results could destroy dynasties. Court diaries hint at Lorenzo de' Medici's circle indulging in private salons where art, poetry, and seduction intertwined. Young artists, desperate for patronage, often found themselves entangled with wealthy patrons in ways that blurred mentorship and intimacy. This dynamic echoes the Bill Clinton-Monica Lewinsky scandal centuries later. A leader, a vulnerable admirer, and the devastating fallout when the private became public. In Florence, accusations of sodomy were wielded as weapons. Men of influence could be ruined by a single claim, even if fabricated. Leonardo da Vinci himself was once accused, though acquitted, and the stigma lingered in whispers. For women, the dangers were greater. Diaries describe noblewomen imprisoned in convents when affairs were uncovered, silenced not for their desires, but for daring to step outside the roles men demanded. Passion here was not only a sin, it was political dynamite. Could love survive when every embrace might become evidence in a trial of power? The Renaissance was a paradox, an age of beauty, faith, and sin. Inside Italy's cathedrals, where painted ceilings promised heaven, priests often wove their own networks of earthly temptation. The confessional, intended as a place of purity, sometimes became the stage for whispered seductions and abuses of power. Court records from Bologna and Venice reveal cases where young women accused priests of turning confession into coercion. Instead of absolution, they were offered secrecy in exchange for submission. These scandals mirror the public downfall of powerful men like Harvey Weinstein, who exploited his position to manipulate those desperate for approval or advancement. In both past and present, the pattern is chillingly familiar. Influence used as a cage, silence demanded as payment. Even bishops weren't immune. Letters preserved in Florentine archives speak of high-ranking clergy entangled in affairs with noblewomen, protected only by their wealth and their robes. When uncovered, women were disgraced while the men returned to their altars, untouched by justice. It was an unholy theater where faith collided with desire and hypocrisy flourished in candlelight. If the church represented morality, what did it mean when its shepherds indulged in the same sins they condemned? And what hope was left for those whose confessions became chains? Behind the gilded walls of Renaissance palaces, feasts were more than displays of wealth. They became playgrounds of excess and hidden perversions. Nobles staged lavish banquets where food, wine, and flesh were all served together. Diaries from Venetian courtiers describe massed gatherings where wives of merchants were paraded before powerful men, compelled to perform for entertainment under the guise of honoring the gods of fertility. It echoes the spectacle-driven scandals of modern elites. Think of Jeffrey Epstein's private parties, glittering on the surface but rotten beneath. In both eras, wealth built shields, and spectacle became the perfect disguise for corruption. Guests laughed, music played, and yet some left in silence, marked by humiliation they could never speak of. In Florence, rumors circulated about poison-laced wine used to silence rivals during these erotic feasts. Pleasure and death danced side by side. One court letter even accused a duke's mistress of orchestrating both seduction and murder to secure her position at court. Here, sex was not love. It was a political weapon, sharpened and deadly. These banquets were not mere indulgence, but theaters of domination, where men flaunted their control and women were treated as currency. Desire and danger intertwined, leaving legacies of shame carved into history. Harvey Weinstein's scandal revealed how unchecked power could turn film sets into cages of fear and abuse. But centuries earlier, Italy's Renaissance courts already thrived on the same hidden coercion. Behind velvet curtains, patrons, painters, and poets became pawns in lustful games that left permanent stains on history. Renaissance Italy dazzled the world with art, music, and philosophy, but beneath its beauty pulsed a darker rhythm. The courts of Florence, Milan, and Venice were not only political stages, but arenas of hidden desires. Patrons who financed artists also demanded loyalty that extended far beyond a painted canvas. Power was currency, and bodies were its collateral. Just as Harvey Weinstein once used Hollywood's glamour to mask predatory control, dukes and princes cloaked their pursuits behind the splendor of patronage. Letters preserved in Florentine archives whisper of private evenings where poets performed verses laced with double meaning, while courtiers were pressured into humiliating games of seduction. Consent became blurred, not spoken, but assumed.
One chilling account from court records describes a banquet where wine flowed until servants were ordered to offer more than plates. The laughter recorded by chroniclers rings with cruelty, masking coercion beneath the guise of festivity. Artists who refused advances risked exile, their careers destroyed with a single decree. These velvet courts, much like Weinstein's film offices centuries later, thrived on silence. Ambition chained victims more tightly than iron, while witnesses turned away, unwilling to challenge the patrons who shaped Italy's golden age. Behind the frescoes that still dazzle today, stories of submission and manipulation remain hidden shadows. Behind the high stone walls of convents and monasteries, the Renaissance church claimed to guard purity. But inside, the rules of silence and obedience often masked a different story. Nuns and novices, meant to live in devotion, were sometimes trapped in arrangements that blurred worship with submission. Abbots and confessors wielded spiritual authority like a weapon, pressing for intimacy under the cloak of divine union. Think of Weinstein's casting couch. Young actresses seeking opportunity,
silenced by fear of exile. Now replace them with novices, their hopes of survival tied to vows. Chroniclers reveal whispered confessions where women admitted to being compelled to practice humility through flesh. Theologians later debated whether such acts were sin, or worse, sacrilege. One Venetian diary notes how visiting patrons under the guise of charity were ushered into secluded cloisters. What followed was hidden behind prayers and locked doors. For women inside, there was no escape. Defiance meant disgrace, punishment, or even banishment from holy orders. Historians argue these stories illustrate not just personal abuse, but institutional power gone unchecked. Just as Hollywood's silence protected Weinstein for decades, Renaissance cloisters buried shame beneath scripture and ritual. The church's control made speaking out impossible, leaving these voices faint echoes on fragile parchment. Florence's elite were known not only for their patronage of the arts, but also for their hunger for pleasure that knew no limits. Lavish banquets stretched long into the night, where tables overflowed with wine, exotic fruits and delicacies brought from across the seas. But food was only the opening act. Behind velvet curtains, the feasts became stages for performances of desire, sometimes playful, sometimes brutal. Think of Bill Clinton's infamous scandal with Malinsky Lewinsky, a political figure trapped when private indulgence collided with public duty. In Renaissance Italy, courtiers and nobles faced no impeachment. Instead, they flaunted excess, their reputations thriving on whispers of their boldest exploits. Chroniclers described massed gatherings where guests shed garments as easily as they shed restraint.
Letters from the Medici archives reveal accounts of banquets where the host orchestrated spectacles blending theater with seduction. Dancers, painted in mythic costumes, acted out tales of gods and mortals, until the line between performance and participation blurred. The guests were not merely spectators, they were lured into the play. For the nobility, these feasts reinforced dominance, showing wealth through decadence and power through possession. Yet to the servants and artists present, these nights carried another story, one of exploitation hidden beneath golden chandeliers. When the feasts ended and the torches dimmed, another theater came alive, the masquerade. Masks offered anonymity, and with anonymity came the freedom to indulge. Hidden behind painted visages, nobles and courtiers slipped into roles of seducer, victim, or voyeur. It was a world where hierarchy blurred for a single night, but power always found its way back to the top. Think of Tiger Woods' scandal, one of the most famous falls from grace in modern sports. Admired for his discipline on the course, his private life revealed excess and temptation that shattered his pristine image. In Renaissance Italy, men of influence knew no such fear of exposure. Their masks were literal, and society celebrated the daring rather than condemned it. Accounts from Venetian masquerades described women disguised as men, priests dressing as peasants, and aristocrats slipping into disguises that freed them from judgment. Yet the stories told by servants whisper of darker truths, coercion, humiliation, and manipulation carried out under the cover of anonymity. What was playful for the elite often became perilous for those without power. The mask was both shield and weapon, allowing desires to be fulfilled without consequence. But every mask carried a secret, secrets that still linger in letters, diaries, and the hidden corners of history. The Renaissance loved masks, but behind every painted smile lay shadows of exploitation. Just as Tiger Woods' scandal revealed the human behind the champion, Italy's masquerades unmasked a darker truth. But the next tale shifts from disguise to betrayal, a story where trust itself became the most dangerous mask of all. Betrayal has always been history's sharpest blade. Think of Bill Clinton's scandal with Monica Lewinsky, an affair that shook trust at the highest level. Renaissance Italy, too, saw betrayal where power and intimacy intertwined, tearing apart alliances and leaving legacies stained with shame. The next story uncovers one such downfall. In Renaissance Italy, betrayal often came wrapped in silk robes and whispered behind cathedral walls. One of the most shocking tales involved Cardinal Cesare Riario, a man sworn to the sanctity of the church, yet entangled in scandal that mirrored the Monica Lewinsky affair centuries later. Where Clinton's betrayal was exposed in the glare of modern media, Riario's downfall was whispered through corridors heavy with incense and political intrigue.
Riario had cultivated influence not through sermons, but through seduction. A Venetian diarist, Marine Sanudo, noted rumors of clandestine meetings where young courtiers, both men and women, were summoned late at night. These gatherings, described in hushed tones, were not prayer circles but carnal councils, where loyalty was tested not by faith but by the willingness to surrender to forbidden intimacy. His secret chamber, hidden behind the sacristy, became a stage where promises of protection, titles, and wealth were sealed with bodies rather than ink. Betrayal struck when one lover, scorned and stripped of favor, leaked letters that exposed Riario's dual life. The words were clear, passionate, and damning, pledges of undying desire written in the hand of a man entrusted with Rome's moral guidance. What followed was not just personal disgrace, but a ripple that shook alliances across Florence and Venice. While Cesare Riario's downfall echoed Clinton's scandal, Venice delivered another tale of betrayal, one that wore a mask, both literal and symbolic. In the floating city of canals, courtesans were not just companions, they were brokers of secrets, pulling strings with painted smiles. One such courtesan, Isabella Venere, captivated nobles and merchants alike, weaving webs of influence that reached as far as the Doge's palace. Historical diaries describe her lavish masked salons during Carnevale, where anonymity cloaked unspeakable acts. Venetian law forbade priests and politicians from such revelry, but letters preserved in the state archives hint at how often those very men slipped into her chambers. A fragment of correspondence from 1523 reveals a senator promising naval contracts in exchange for knights of surrender under her silken mask. Yet Isabella's downfall came when she was accused of betraying the secrets of state to a foreign ambassador. Betrayal was unusual in politics, but her method of extracting confessions, seduction at its boldest, scandalized even a city built on indulgence. Venice, both horrified and fascinated, turned her trial into spectacle. She stood accused not just of treason, but of using intimacy as her dagger, a charge as potent as poison in an age where reputation meant survival. This Florentine scandal, buried for centuries, survives not only in written accounts, but perhaps in paintings still hanging in silent chapels today. Each brushstroke becomes a haunting reminder that art can preserve not only beauty, but shame. In Venice, scandal wore a mask. Carnival was more than music and color. It was a season of hidden identities, of nobles mingling with commoners, and of dangerous freedoms that blurred boundaries. Behind velvet masks, whispers turned into bargains, and intimacy became a currency traded as ruthlessly as gold. Historical records like the 16th century Venetian diaries preserved in the Bibliotheca Marciana describe how senators and merchants secretly purchased the company of masked courtesans, sometimes men dressed as women, sometimes women in disguise. One Venetian diarist confessed, "I laid with a stranger whose face I never saw, and only later learned she was the wife of a magistrate." In such secrecy, betrayal thrived. Powerful families exploited this freedom.
Some used carnival nights to humiliate rivals, arranging encounters where hidden lovers were revealed, masks pulled away at the peak of desire. It was political theater, scandal turned weapon. The echoes of this practice feel startlingly modern, like the Paris Hilton tape scandal, where private indulgence was exposed to destroy a public image. Venetian elites lived in constant fear that their masked knights might unmask them forever, turning hidden pleasure into permanent disgrace. Carnival was a dangerous playground, and when the masks came off, reputations shattered. But Venice's masked games were only the beginning. Across Italy, as war, betrayal, and lust collided at Caporetto, scandal became even darker. If Venice hid its sins behind masks, the battlefield tore them off in brutal exposure. What happened next would stain reputations more deeply than any carnival night.